Hey guys, this is Mr. Farmer. Yesterday we talked about the New England colonies up here, how they were mainly formed for religious freedom. And today we're going to talk about the middle colonies right here and the southern colonies right here. So they were very different. So we're going to go through them one by one. So we'll start with Maryland. Maryland is this pink colony right here. If you go to Washington, D.C. this year, Maryland is right above Washington, D.C. So Maryland was started similar to some of the colonies in New England. Maryland was started for religious freedom, and it was founded for a religious group called the English Catholics. And they came here to escape the Church of England, similar to how the Puritans came to Massachusetts. They were led by a man named Cecilius Calvert. And Cecilius Calvert was known as Lord Baltimore. Hence the city in Maryland, Baltimore. And he started it as a refuge for Catholics. And the word refuge just means a safe place. And it was named after the Queen of England, and her name was Queen Henrietta Maria. So from Maria, they created the state Maryland. In Maryland, they were safe from persecution. The Catholics had been persecuted in England similar to how the Puritans were, and they needed a safe place to go. So over here in America, they discovered that Massachusetts was mainly Puritan, so they created their own place, and they named it Maryland. Now, in Maryland, Lord Baltimore wanted to ensure that they always had religious freedom. So he created a law called the Toleration Act of 1649. And to tolerate something means that you put up with it. You may not like it, but you allow it to happen. So they basically made a law that any religions were allowed, and you could not restrict the acts of any Christians. So his law was called the Toleration Act of 1649, and it made restricting the religious acts of any Christians a crime. The next state I'm going to talk to you about it's actually two states, and that is the Carolinas. So the Carolinas were not created for any particular religious group. They were simply a gift. They were a gift from this guy, and his name is King Charles. And you can see right here it says Carolina comes from the word Carolus, which is the Latin form of the name King Charles. So basically Carolina is derived from the Latin word for Charles, and there's also a city there in South Carolina, Charleston, which is also named after King Charles. So it was basically a land grant. He gave it to 8 of his friends, and these 8 friends decided it was too big to govern, so they divided it in half, and they named it North Carolina and South Carolina. So it was named for the Latin name for King Charles, and there's also a big city there in South Carolina called Charleston. One unique thing about the Carolinas that made it different than some of the other colonies is the fact that the Carolinas actually had a very large slave population. There was actually more blacks than whites in the Carolinas around this time of colonization due to the production of one particular cash crop, and that was the cash crop rice. Rice grows very well in a marshy type environment, which is what the environment is in the Carolinas, and the production of rice requires a lot of manual labor. So for that reason, there was a lot of slaves in North and South Carolina. So they had a large black population due to the production of rice, which requires a lot of labor. This is what the colonies looked like at this point. One thing you'll notice is that there's really no western border, and the reason is they didn't really have one. They just kind of ended right here, And the reason they ended right here is this is where the Appalachian Mountains were. So it was really just a simple fact that people couldn't cross over these mountains. So they just kind of ended here. The next colonies I'm going to talk to you about is New York, which is right here, and New Jersey, which is right here. Okay, New York. At one point, New York was actually called New Netherlands because it was controlled by the Dutch. So this area right here was called New Netherlands. There was a few hundred Dutch settlers here, and the English decided that they wanted, so they sent a group of ships over, a part of their navy, and they parked their navy right here in the bay of New York City, the harbor of New York City, and they pointed their cannons at the Dutch, and they said, you have two choices. You can hand this over to the English, or we're going to open fire. And the few hundred Dutch settlers that were here decided they didn't want trouble, so they handed it over, and it became property of the English. So the guy that headed this mission, his title was the Duke of York. So he renamed it New York, after York in England. So that's how New York came to be an English colony and how it got its name. So England took New Netherland from the Dutch and named it New York. New Jersey, on the other hand, was known as a very diverse colony. There was a broad range of settlers in New Jersey. There was people from the Netherlands, who we call Dutch. There were Swedes from Sweden, Finns from Finland, and Scots from Scotland. So a very diverse place. And New Jersey was mainly known for a couple things. One was the growing of wheat, and another one was the fur trade. Fur trade was the dominant industry in New Jersey. Okay, the next colony I'm going to talk to you about is Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is right here. It's this kind of square-shaped green state on the map. This is the same map that's hanging up in the front of the room, and this is an important state. A lot of big things happen here. Philadelphia is right here, and Philadelphia was where a lot of important events went down. One, for example, is the Constitution is written here. Another, for example, is the Declaration of Independence is written here. So it's an important state. Pennsylvania was created by a man who wanted a safe haven for his religious group, and his religious group was the Quakers. You may have seen this image on a box of Quaker Oats oatmeal, and that's a picture of this man. His name is William Penn. And William Penn needed a safe place for Quakers to practice their religion. The Quakers were known as the Society of Friends, and they believed in equality, and they were a big part of the Underground Railroad. If you remember from Camp Joy, there was a part where you had to stop at a Quaker cabin, and you had to send somebody up to the door and ask, are you a friend of a friend? And that comes from their nickname, being known as the Society of Friends. So they believed in equality for Indians and equality for slaves. They were a big part of the Underground Railroad. And William Penn needed a safe place for these Quakers. And they were persecuted in England, just like Puritans were, just like Catholics were. If you were not a member of the Church of England, the king persecuted you. So the Quakers created this place called Pennsylvania. Now, when you write this word, be careful not to put a C right here, or it says Quackers. I have a lot of people do that. So they're not Quackers, they're Quakers. The last colony I'm going to talk to you about is Georgia. Georgia is named after a king. You guessed it, King George. So King George allowed this colony to be created, and it was the idea of a man named James Oglethorpe. And James Oglethorpe had the idea to give this land to poor people, indentured servants who had nowhere to go, and people who were former convicts and couldn't get jobs, and people who owed debts. And even people over in England could come across the sea and build this colony along the Savannah River here and in Georgia. And the king said, you know what, that's a good idea. And he had a couple reasons. Number one, these people needed a place to go. And number two, there was another European power that was settled down here in Florida, and that was the Spanish, the conquistadors. And they were scary. So the king knew that if the conquistadors ever decided to come up into the colonies and attack, they would have to go through Georgia and go through their poor people first. So while that sounds horrible, that was his line of thinking. So it accomplished two things. It gave poor people and people in debt a place to go, and it also provided a buffer. It was basically a human shield between the Spanish conquistadors in Florida and the rest of the colonies. They would have to go all the way around the Appalachian Mountains like that, or they would have to go through the poor people in Georgia. So but it was a good thing. It gave people land who had no other place to go. So Georgia, it was started by James Oglethorpe, named after King George, and it was started essentially for poor English citizens. Georgia is known for their large plantations. And that is the end of the southern and the middle colonies. Thank you for your attention. Put this note sheet in your binder in your notes section right now.